We're joined right now by the Tablets Rome correspondent, Robert Mickens. Very, very good morning to you.
Good to be with you, Julia. I just want to say I'm a former tablet correspondent.
Oh,
I'm actually with the Union of Catholic Asian News, otherwise known as UCA News, after a year-long sabbatical. So I'll
well,
be
thank you for clarifying
writing
that.
again this week.
I very much appreciate that. Right, I do want to ask you, obviously, about, the cardinals have gathered in Rome today and have already set the date and the time for the Pope Francis's funeral. It will be this Saturday, 9 o'clock UK time. Can you just talk to us a little bit about his legacy? I mean, he was an 88-year-old man. He'd been Pope for quite some time, and not as long as Pope John Paul II, who's very much, I think, for my generation, the Pope we all knew about. What is his legacy?
Well, I think it's hard to sum up in a few words, but one of the things that always impressed me about Pope Francis was, and this might sound kind of strange or corny, but he was so comfortable in his own skin. And I think that was something that made a deep impression on a lot of people, although they might not express it in those words. I think people just saw him as a genuine person, that he wasn't worried too much about playing the role of the Pope. He wasn't really interested in a lot of the protocols. I think sometimes when somebody becomes a Pope, take, for example, Benedict XVI, who is really a theology professor at heart. I think when he became Pope, he felt the weight of that office and felt he must do certain things according to the longstanding customs and protocols. Francis, from the very beginning, he just acted like he was getting another job.
Yeah. He seemed
from one diocese to another.
Yeah, he seemed to not be that particularly interested in the pomp and the circumstance. And
more.
It seemed
But
to be...
even more than that, I think he just felt like, okay, this is a new job that I have. I was a bishop in Buenos Aires, and now I'm the Bishop of Rome. I mean, he even used the same vestments and his mitre, and it drove the people in the ceremonial office in the Vatican kind of crazy because he didn't want to wear, right from the very beginning, he didn't want to dress up in the red shoulder cape that popes usually wear when they come out and address the crowds. And he said, no, I just put on the stole before I give the blessing. And as soon as he gave the blessing, he took the stole off. And I think that kind of was a signal right there that this is going to be different.
Okay. And in terms of the things he talked about a lot, now, he did seem to me, he was a fairly woke Pope, certainly in his words. The question is whether he was in reality. He talked about, gay rights. He was very much, talking about the rights of people in Gaza. He talked about climate change. He criticised politicians for their policies, including Americans, on refugees and things like that. He was quite sort of very much a woke, almost quite a political Pope. But did he actually do anything? Because he was supposed to be very much representing the poor. He's an Argentinian Pope, son of Italian migrants, and it was all about, helping the poor. In terms of actually tackling some of the big issues, I mean, in terms of poverty in many major Catholic countries, 1.4 billion Catholics around the world, many of them living in rather poor states, in rather poor conditions themselves. Did he, as the leader of the Catholic Church for all that time, do anything to try and help those people, or was it all talk?
I think to understand Pope Francis, you have to understand his way of looking at the world. I would say that probably more than any other Pope that we've seen in our lifetime, certainly in the modern era perhaps, he was a radically evangelical Pope. And I don't mean that like evangelical Christians, but someone like St. Francis of Assisi, whose name he took for his papal moniker. He was somebody who was much more rooted in reading the signs of the times or what was happening in the world through the lens of the gospel. As Jesus, the saying, what would Jesus do? Francis, for example, you brought up the issue of climate change. He didn't look at climate change like Greta Thunberg, maybe. He looked at climate change or the earth as part of God's creation. And his take on protecting what he called our common home was, this is God's creation. And not only the birds, not only the trees or the rivers and the forests, but also the human person. So it was really an A to Z kind of complete view of human life as the creation. And that goes to his radical adherence to the gospel. I mean, I would just say, for example, previous popes were quoting a lot of their predecessors. Francis rarely did that. He quoted the gospel. I mean, you might think it's strange to say he was a real Christian. Well, of course, he's the Pope. But
Hey, we've
I
had
think,
archbishops who don't believe in the afterlife, I think. So,
you
I mean,
know,
I don't know. There we are. Can I just ask you in terms of the legacy now, though, because an awful lot of the cardinals who are going to be making the decision about who the next pope is are people who are, sorry, people. They're men, let's be honest, they're men who've been appointed.
okay.
The only time we're not woke, of course, the Catholic Church, and indeed a lot of most churches, most religions, but they've been appointed by this man, and many of them from African nations and sort of the global South, as it's known. That comes with its own problems, doesn't it? Because we know one of the biggest battles, and we've certainly had the Church of England, and I think the Catholic Church as well, is this battle between sort of movement to sort of be a bit more modern in the Western nations and the Northern nations, but actually some very, shall we say, traditional Catholic views regarding women, gay people, many other issues among many of those other cardinals from perhaps less sort of modernised nations. That's going to be an issue in terms of who gets selected as the next pope, isn't it?
Well, I think what the next conclave is going to be is a referendum on Pope Francis's 12-year pontificate. And I would just point out, I mean, I caution about, more like 80% or more of these men were actually made cardinals by Pope Francis. And the assumption is, of course, that he stacked the deck and that we're going to get somebody that's a kind of a replica of Pope Francis. I would just caution against that because this is a dispersed group of men. Not all of them share the Pope's priorities. I mean, there are some pretty clerical cardinals in this group of 135 electors named by Pope Francis. And Pope Francis, as you well know, railed against clericalism. It's anybody's guess why he picked some of these men. I mean, you got a cardinal who's an Italian missionary from Mongolia, of all places. I mean, they have like 10 Catholics there. And there's a cardinal in Tonga. I mean, maybe 12 Catholics there. Yeah. I'm exaggerating, of course. Yeah. But the point is, the point is that these are people that we don't really know an awful lot about. And the bigger issue is they don't know an awful lot about each other because Francis never brought them all together as a body. So the next, 10 to 15 days, 15 to 20 days, they've got to kind of get to know each other. They're already arriving in Rome as we speak. They're trickling in. And this morning at 9 a.m., they already began what we call the general congregations. That is meetings of all the cardinals, even the ones over the age of 80 who cannot participate in the conclave. What they're doing is they're meeting and they're talking about the state of the church. So they're going to get some reports from financial institutions inside the Vatican to get a snapshot of what is the situation of the church right now. They'll get some global statistics. And while they're doing that, they'll also be talking about what has to happen as the church goes forward. What should our priorities be? And what should the type of pope that we need.
And also often it's age, isn't it? They don't want someone who's too elderly, won't last very long, but also not someone too young who's going to be there 30 years. Just finally, and I feel terrible saying briefly, but we are almost out of time. One of the biggest issues that most people who are not, like me, members of the Catholic Church, have known about the Catholic Church in the last few decades has been the issue of the legacy of child abuse and the cover-up of child abuse on a mass scale by senior figures in the Church. It certainly dogged, the previous Pope an awful lot. This Pope talked the talk on this. Many of the victims of paedophile priests say actually he didn't walk the walk, he didn't take enough action. He, like many, and we've seen it in the Church of England, we've seen it in many organisations around the world, actually simply just sort of move people along, cover it up, try and move on from it. Do you think that's a legacy that now cannot be ignored anymore?
Well, I would preface this by saying that Pope Francis was not perfect, and as none of us are. And I've been a critic of someone who's, I'm like a Pope critic. There are art critics and music critics. That doesn't mean they don't like art or music, but it does mean that they have to look at their subject matter with some objectivity. And I've been one of the critics of Pope Francis on a few issues like women. He's talked a good talk, and usually he's walked the talk. Well, on the issue of women, I think his baggage as a man from Latin America, who's an elderly man from Latin America and a priest, I think that he just could not get around that on this issue. Similarly, with the abuse issue, the one positive thing that Pope Francis has done is he set down some very strong protocols. I think it will be up to his successor and the men and women that successor surrounds himself with to implement more stringently those protocols.
Robert Mickens, so appreciate you joining us, former Rome correspondent at the Tablet. Thank you very much indeed for that. I must ask you, Tom Slater, listening to all of that, first thing I'm terrible, you know, being the terrible human being that I am. Yesterday, when I'd heard the news and saw the news about Pope Francis, just remembered that David Lammy tweet, which he put out long before he was Foreign Secretary, who's backbench, but still a Labour MP. And there was news back in 2013 about, obviously, who was going to become the next Pope. Live video from the BBC News tweet: Chimney of Sistine Chapel as conclave votes for a Pope. Will smoke be black or white? And David Lammy, then a Labour MP, now our Foreign Secretary, wrote, this tweet from the BBC is crass and unnecessary. Do we really need silly innuendo about the race of the next Pope? I mean, A, jumping to race. B, the fact that he didn't know. I mean, I would have known at the age of even 18, you know, that you did the black or white smoke. That was something that was known, wasn't it? And you'd expect a Labour MP to know that. I mean, genuinely scary.
No, absolutely. And especially given the fact that in his current position, it's important that you understand how institutions like the Catholic Church work. It's not an unimportant institution. It represents 1.4 billion people across the world. It has a tremendous amount of kind of geopolitical significance as a consequence of that. Hence why you have many of these scandals with some of the positions and some of the statements that Pope Francis made, whether it was on Gaza or Ukraine or other kind of conflicts. So another example of how, when it comes to actually being a kind of grown-up government, a grown-up country, this Labour administration really struggles with some of the basics.
One of the things I find strange, and again, I feel the same way about royal family as well, or, you know, or anybody. If you want to make political commentary, as this Pope did, and I mean, I remember I grew up, you know, Pope John Paul II, absolutely plays a crucial role in sort of finding support in Poland, you know, the downfall of communism. I mean, really, really important role. And I say this as someone, you know, full-on, you know, fundamentalist atheist, for goodness sake. But if you want to make comments about, you know, Gaza, about refugees, about climate change, about you know, we're allowed to hold you to task and take you to task about it and question it. The Pope is now a political figure, whether you like it or not. And I do think people should talk. I understand people who are grieving, who are Catholics. I completely understand that. But we're talking about the death of a significant world political figure, and we need to talk about that in a sensible way, rather than just sort of, you know, people sort of, let's all wear black and talk about somebody as if they were, you know, they didn't have that significance. If you're going to have that impact and that significance, you need to be held to account. We need to question it. We need to be able to criticise and condemn or condone. And
also it has so much bearing, doesn't it, on the decision that is now taken in terms of his successor, because of the fact that he does leave a church much more divided than it was previously, precisely because questions of climate, questions of geopolitics, questions of migration have been brought into that sphere in a way that it wasn't previously, and there's therefore upset particularly a lot of the clergy in places like Africa who take a very different view. So that is going to have
horrible, nasty, backward views.
That's something that's something that will naturally come up. You know, this isn't. It's not, as you say, something which is irrelevant to the conversation.
No, exactly.